Hey folks, welcome back to Perspectives on Human Communication. We are going to just do a really quick overview of Nancy Hartsock and Julia Wood's standpoint theory, or as your text outlines it, Feminist Standpoint Theory. There's a slight difference between the origins of standpoint theory and the way it has been adapted to the experience of women in society, and it has become in our textbook, Feminist Standpoint Theory, as Hartsock and Wood have outlined it. So let's start by thinking about standpoint theory using the old story of the blind people who come across an elephant, and each one of them is touching a certain part of the elephant. One person is feeling the tusks, and another is feeling the trunk, and another is grabbing onto the leg, and another grabs the tail, and the other's the ear, and another one is sensing and feeling the side of the elephant. And each one of them comes away with a different experience of that elephant. Now, this is a great story, and some people have talked about it as if it captures the essence of standpoint theory, and the fact is it just doesn't. Because in standpoint theory, a standpoint is different from a perspective. And so it captures the idea of a standpoint being partial in its understanding, but what it misses out, what that picture or that illustration misses out on, is that a standpoint is given to us by our social location. So let's talk a little bit about the origins of standpoint theory, and then we'll go over the nutshell and then call that an overview for this particular video. So this theory finds its origin in the work of a German-born philosopher, Georg Hegel. And Hegel wrote a book called The Phenomenology of Spirit, in which he discussed this notion of the Enlightenment idea of the self being isolated and self-contained, and that your identity was separate, apart from all other identities. And he just said that's not true. Our identities are in the mix of lots of identities, and those identities are found in a society or a social grouping, and the identity that we form is really shaped by and constrained by, in other words, the social location or the social grouping that we emerge within. And so our identity is not isolated and self-contained or self-formed. It's actually shaped by many of the variables around us, our race and our socioeconomic status and the amount of education that we have access to, the language that we really inhabit. We are born into a language community, and that language has pre-existing ideas and meanings and words, and we embrace those words when we learn the language. And so there's a lot of who we are and our identity that we have no control over. So he talks about this, and then he looks at an example of a master-slave relationship and the dominance or the hierarchy, the power relationship that's involved in that master-slave duality. And he talks about the access to truth or understanding based upon that relationship and your position in that relationship. And so that's all part of a standpoint, that you occupy this social location, for instance, the position of being a slave, that you are in servitude to someone, and you occupy that position, and that gives you a standpoint or a viewpoint of life, of reality, and a position in terms of accuracy in how you understand things. And so that's what standpoint theory is really trying to get at. And he demonstrated that there's different standpoints or viewpoints based upon your status, even if what you think that you're apprehending or seeing the same reality, or even living within the same reality, you're experiencing that reality differently. And the theory has a lot to say about whose reality or who has the best viewpoint or the most accurate viewpoint on that reality, and we'll talk about that in class. So here's the theory in a nutshell. There's a couple of ideas. We'll get into the assumptions for this theory in class and try to illustrate each assumption. But the theory in a nutshell says that people occupy these specific social hierarchies, again, socioeconomically, intellectually, politically, ethnoculturally, even internationally. All of these demographic and sociographic kinds of markers, we occupy these places in a social grouping or a social position, a social location. So that's one of the ideas in this theory. Another idea is that we will view our reality or the social situation from these specific vantage points or standpoints. And those vantage points, when they are in a superordinate or subordinate kind of relationship, will oppose each other. There will usually be a power dimension in how we see things. So let's say that you work in a company and you're in management, and the company communicates layoffs. You will see that layoff situation differently, whether you're in management or you're just a line worker, a lower level employee worker that's maybe subject to the layoff. You're going to see that same reality very differently. And then the final idea in the nutshell is that all of these standpoints, any standpoint, is partial in its view. And I like to think of that aspect of this theory as pretty biblical. This is what we call gold from Egypt, if you're Augustine, right? He said when the Israelites fled Egypt, they took a lot of possessions from Egypt that were made out of Egyptian, materials. Speaking of gold, valuable materials, raw materials. And so it had worth, it had usefulness as they carried that Egyptian product out of Egypt. And sometimes we stumble across these sort of biblical truths in secular knowledge, and you can think of it as Augustine's gold from Egypt, at least I do. And so all these ideas between an idea within a standpoint, a perspective from a standpoint, is partial. And Paul talks about this, where he says, we see through a glass darkly. Someday we'll see face to face, and we'll know in full, just as we're known in full by God. But the partiality of our perspective, of our apprehension of reality, is such a key truth. Man, I can't emphasize that enough. If you can grab onto that truth, that biblical truth, it's going to help you understand a lot of life in any area. And I think it also communicates a strong sense of humility if you just admit that the way I see things is partial. It's through a glass darkly right now. And this theory really nails that one, I think. So key concepts include the idea of voice. The voice that you have relates to your identity. And somebody who has voice has power. Silence is a way of suppressing voice. A voice that does not get to speak is from a different standpoint and lacks the power and might have something to say, might have something really valuable to say, but the power relationship in society isn't hearing it, isn't letting it say. And so voice is a big part of this. Some standpoints don't have a lot of voice. And that's where the feminist kind of perspective on this grabs hold, because women's voices have been suppressed throughout time, throughout history. You think about the women's suffrage movement, that it took a long time for women to get to vote in our country. There was a lot of voting going on for a long time, and women didn't get to participate in that until Congress passed the 19th Amendment, allowing women the vote in 1919. And it took more than a year to then ratify it after it was passed by Congress. So that's a key example of how women's voices have been suppressed over the years. And still in many ways, women don't have equal voice or the same voice that men have in a lot of different contexts. So voice is a big part of this theory. Standpoint, we've already talked about that it's a social location. It is not just a perspective. It's different than just having a perspective. A standpoint is something that you inhabit, and sometimes it's put on you. That achieving a certain standpoint or moving away from out of a given standpoint often involves struggle, and the chapter talks about that. Situatedness of knowledge, or knowledges, as the book talks about. That situated knowledge is this idea that what you know is really a function of where you are, the information that you have access to, how you're accessing it. There are a lot of things that go into the fact that what you know and how you see is situated by your circumstances. And so that's a big part of this theory. And then division of labor. That idea, key concept, really reflects more of the Hegelian Marxist roots of this theory, and that men and women have occupied, and it's more relevant, I think, to feminist standpoint theory than just standpoint theory in general, but that women and men have occupied different labor positions, that there's a division of labor aspect of standpoint. And this goes back to Hegel's ideas, and Marx, who built on Hegel, took Hegel's ideas and applied them to economic relationships, that you usually have a wealthy elite class, the bourgeoisie, and then you have the working lower class, the proletariat, and there's usually a power dynamic that involves exploitation in that relationship. And so this theory suggests too that there's exploitation involved in some of the relationships that happen due to standpoints. So that's a quick overview, and the nutshell. We'll really unpack this in class and try to illustrate it and help you to think about how it applies maybe to current life. We'll see you in class.